drive down the cost of the overall sensor loads, focus in on the
important aspects, source. This is the extraordinary story of climate change. Vaccines, Europe, the Taliban, Ukraine. Symbolically, it's very important. Let's take this stage by stage. Here's the BBC's Stephen McDonald in Beijing. The West has stepped up sanctions against Russia. Let's look at some of the international reaction. Tell us what you've been hearing in practical terms. What does that mean? Next, we have to step back and let's just remind ourselves this is all part of the same story.
Piece the story together with Ros Atkins. Outside Source, Monday to Thursday at 7 on the BBC News Channel. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues, BBC News has in-depth coverage.
It's very clear the war in this area is extremely active.
This is the site of a Russian missile attack on the eastern edge of Kharkiv.
The Ukrainians have already pushed the Russians out of their city once. The fear is they're going to have to do it again.
See the headlines as they happen with breaking news alerts in the app and get the full story with bbc.com/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.
Welcome to this BBC News special, The Fall of Kabul 1 year on. I'm Yalda Hakim. Hundreds of Taliban fighters gather in Kabul's central square and in other parts of Afghanistan to celebrate the first anniversary of their takeover of the country. But over the past 12 months, the economy has been in free fall. Many girls still can't go to school. And there's a humanitarian crisis, something I've seen firsthand. Everywhere you look in this ward, there's a mother praying, and it feels like that's all they have now. Every baby and child in here is in a critical state, and we just don't know if they're going to make it.
And I'm pleased to set live in Kabul on a day of reflection for Afghans across this country and far beyond, and the profound and for many painful changes of the past year.
I'm Sikandar Kamani, live in Kandahar, the spiritual heartland of the Taliban, and where their ultimate power still resides.
In the next hour, we'll be reflecting on the United States' chaotic exit and examining where Afghanistan stands today, with guests in Kabul and the United States. Welcome to this special program, The Fall of Kabul 1 year on. 12 months ago today, the Taliban took control of the capital of Afghanistan, Kabul. The Western-backed government had collapsed and the world watched in disbelief. It came after a lightning advance across the country by the militant group as it seized province after province from Afghanistan's military. Their victory, the chaotic evacuation of Afghans and foreigners, the images of desperate young men trying to cling to a US military plane taking off from Kabul airport was a moment of reckoning for the West, which had funded and armed the Afghan government. In the next hour, we'll look at what was promised by the Taliban leaders 12 months ago and the state of Afghanistan now. First, let's look back at these pictures from a year ago, which shocked the world. Many Western-backed Afghan government leaders had already fled, while thousands of Afghan citizens and foreigners, fearing Taliban rule, scrambled to find room on flights out. In the next few months, many aspects of life slid towards collapse, with food shortages, power cuts, and with the approaching winter, a humanitarian crisis. I returned to Afghanistan in late 2021 and saw for myself the impact, especially on the youngest of victims, children. When I visited a pediatric ward at a hospital in Kabul, there I saw badly malnourished children with their mothers who had little hope for the future. Here's what I saw. Well, while many in Afghanistan say they've lost their freedoms, for the Taliban and their supporters, today is a day of celebration. The Taliban have declared a national holiday to mark 1 year since they seized power. The movement's black and white flags are flying in the main square in the capital, and pickup trucks full of fighters are patrolling the streets. In some areas, the Taliban takeover has been welcomed as marking the end of years of fighting between the Taliban and the former Afghan security forces backed by international troops. Well, over the past year, myself and my colleagues in Afghanistan and correspondent Secunda Kamani and our chief international correspondent Lise Doucette have been following the story. They join me now from Kabul and Kandahar. Thank you both for joining me and for your reporting over not just the last year, but for many years. And Lise, I'm going to come to you first because, of course, you've covered every twist and turn in Afghanistan for more than 3 decades. I just want your assessment of being back in Kabul now, a year after the Taliban takeover. We've just lost Secunda, of course. He's in Kandahar, so the connection isn't great. But that was Secunda Kamani. And of course, we will be speaking to Lise again a little later in the programme. Thank you so much, Lise, for joining us as well. Now, on the day Kabul fell to the Taliban, I was on air while it was happening and hearing from many in the capital who were telling me that they were extremely worried about what their future would look like under the rule of hardline militants. I took a call from the Taliban spokesperson, Sohail Shaheen, who gave these assurances to the Afghan people. Have a listen. That was Sohail Shaheen there. Well, that was also August 2021, 15th of August 2021. 7 months later, on the 23rd of March, female students arrived for their start of their school year to find that their classrooms were shut with Taliban guards at the gate. Today, girls older than 12 have been without education for more than a year. My colleague Yalda Hakim asked the Taliban spokesperson in Kabul, Zabiullah Mujahid, whether that will change. Have a listen. That was my colleague Yogita Lamai speaking to Taliban spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid. Well, let's bring in our guests now. In a moment, we'll talk to former US National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, Heather Barr from Human Rights Watch, and Ramiz Alakbarov, the United Nations representative in Kabul. But first, let's speak to Tuba Lutfi, an Afghan activist in Kabul. Tuba John, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. We've been talking a lot about all the changes in Kabul in the last 12 months, but as an Afghan woman living there under Taliban rule, how much has your life changed? Okay, Tuba John, thank you so much for joining us here from Kabul and sharing your thoughts. I know it's not easy, but thank you.
Most welcome.
Now, when the US withdrew from Afghanistan last year, critics said that the United States wouldn't be able to operate counterterrorism effectively. 2 weeks ago, though, the US carried out a drone strike in Kabul, killing the leader of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri. He was a big prize for the United States, and Washington said he'd been living in Afghanistan with the Taliban's knowledge and approval. Well, here's Taliban spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid again on what it means for Taliban-American relations. Have a listen. Well, in a moment, we'll talk to Heather Barr from Human Rights Watch and Ramiz Alakbarov, the United Nations representative in Kabul. But first, let's go to former US National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster. General McMaster, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. We were just hearing there from Zabiullah Mujahid, who says that the Taliban have no connection or links to al-Qaeda, despite Ayman al-Zawahiri being found there. Do you believe him? General McMaster, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme.
Thank you, Yalda.
Now, as we've been reporting, the humanitarian situation is dire for millions of Afghans. Human Rights Watch has been documenting abuses under the Taliban in the past year. In its most recent report, it says the Taliban have broken multiple pledges to respect human rights and women's rights, suppressed media, and arbitrarily detained, tortured, and executed its critics. Well, Heather Barr is the Associate Director of the Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. Heather, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. You and I have been speaking for a year about this, almost on a regular basis. But you're just listening there to General McMaster and Tuba Lutfi, and women's rights activist. I mean, this is quite a grim assessment of the situation on the ground. Thank you very much for joining us here a year after the Taliban took control of Afghanistan.
Thanks for all your work, Yalda.
Since the takeover, Afghanistan's economy has nearly collapsed. Before NATO and US troops left and the Afghan government was ousted, 45% of the country's economy came from foreign aid, and 90% of Afghans lived on an income of less than $2 a day. Let's go live now to Kabul, and Ramiz Alakbarov is the United Nations Secretary General's Deputy Special Representative for Afghanistan. Thank you so much, Dr. Ramiz, for joining us here on the programme. It does feel in many ways, and would you say it's fair to say that Afghanistan is in survival mode? Dr. Ramiz, thank you so much for joining us here on this special.
Thank you for having me.
Now we'll have more on the economy with the Asia-Pacific Director at the UN Development Programme in the next few minutes. But first, let's go back to Kabul now and speak to our Chief International Correspondent, Lise Doucette, who joins us from there. And Lise, of course, you are also in Kabul. You've been going back and forth over the last year. You've seen the dire humanitarian crisis as well and witnessed it. That was Lise Doucette reporting on the humanitarian situation in Ghor. Well, a year on, this is what the Afghan economy looks like. The UN Development Programme estimates the country's GDP contracted by 20% since the Taliban's takeover. Per capita income has plummeted, while prices of essentials are up by 35%. And an estimated 700,000 jobs have been lost since this date a year ago. Well, for more on this, let's go live to New York now. And Kani Wignaraja is Asia-Pacific Director of the United Nations Development Programme. Kani, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. It's been a year since the Taliban took over. We've just read some statistics there and the impact on the economy. But I just want your reflections and observations. Kani Wignaraja, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme.
Thank you, Yalda.
Now, after the Taliban takeover of the country, terror attacks claimed by the Islamic State of Khorasan Province, or ISKP, have been on the rise. Militants claimed the huge attack on Kabul airport in August last year that killed more than 175 people. ISKP is an offshoot of the violent Islamic group that calls itself the Islamic State. It was formed in 2014 by breakaway fighters of the Pakistan Taliban and Afghan fighters who pledged allegiance to the late IS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Well, Afghan journalist Fazil Munallah Kazizai is the correspondent for the magazine New Lines. He has recently interviewed leaders of the Islamic State of Khorasan Province, and he joins me now. Thank you very much, Fazil, for joining us here on the programme. You've been researching ISKP's presence in Afghanistan for many, many years. I just want your assessment of the threat from ISK today than the previous government.
The business, the previous government.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time here, Fazil, but thank you so much for your investigation and for joining us, and our audience can read that online. That's it from me and our guests here for this BBC special programme. Stay with us. We've got General Petraeus coming up in the next few minutes.
I'm Ross Atkins with Outside Source. This is the extraordinary story of climate change. Vaccines for Ukraine. Let's look at some of the international reaction. Tell us what you've been hearing. In practical terms, what does that mean?
Piece the story together with Ross Atkins. Outside Source on BBC World News.
Hello, this is Impact. I'm Yalda Hakim. Hundreds of Taliban fighters gather in Kabul's central square to celebrate the first anniversary of their takeover of the country. There were similar scenes across the country.
Taliban members and supporters who have gathered here in the centre of Kandahar. Today is the first anniversary of their independence, as they see it, the culmination of their struggle against the US-led international presence here.
We'll reflect on the United States' chaotic exit and examine where Afghanistan stands today with former CIA Director General David Petraeus. Kenya is set to release its official election results. We'll be live in Nairobi with all the latest. Towns in the eastern Ukraine come under fire as the UN calls for a demilitarized zone to prevent nuclear disaster. That's all coming up here on Impact. Welcome welcome to the program. It's exactly a year since the Taliban dramatically and unexpectedly returned to power in Afghanistan, and they've been celebrating on the streets of the capital, Kabul, on what's been declared a national holiday. But serious, deep-rooted issues continue to blight the country, among them severe food shortages and the status of women and girls. Yugita Lamai has all the latest. That was Secunder Kamani and Lise Doucette reporting there from across Afghanistan. Let's go live now to Arlington, Virginia, and speak to the former CIA Director General David Petraeus, who commanded US troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. General Petraeus, always good to speak to you. Today, in some parts of Afghanistan, namely Kandahar, in Kabul, the Taliban are celebrating the victory over what they say is the biggest military alliance. From where you're sitting, biggest military alliance in history, from where you're sitting, how do you view what happened 12 months ago? General Petraeus, always good to have you here on the program. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Yalda.
Stay with us here on Impact, still to come. You're on from the Taliban takeover. We hear about the impact on the most vulnerable in society. This is Impact on BBC World News. I'm Yalda Hakim. More now on our top story. A year since the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. In the past 12 months, many aspects of life have slid towards collapse, with food shortages, power cuts, and with the approaching winter, humanitarian crisis. Our chief international correspondent Lise Doucette travelled to Ghor province in the central highlands of Afghanistan, which is one of the poorest regions in Afghanistan. Well, Iran says Sir Salman Rushdie and his supporters are solely to blame for last week's attack, in which he was stabbed multiple times. Tehran also denies any involvement. The author remains in a critical condition in hospital in America, but can now breathe unaided. He has faced years of death threats for his 1988 novel, The Satanic Verses. A 24-year-old man has pleaded not guilty to attempted murder and assault. A court in military-ruled Myanmar has sentenced the country's ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi to 6 more years in prison after finding her guilty of corruption charges. Ms. Suu Kyi was accused of abusing her position to rent public land at below market prices and to divert funds meant for charitable causes to build a residence. Ms. Suu Kyi denied all the charges. She's already been sentenced to 11 years in prison on other corruption charges at earlier trials. India has celebrated its 75th anniversary of independence from Britain with colourful celebrations and ceremonies in the capital Delhi and all around the country. Speaking from the ramparts of the historic Red Fort in New Delhi, Prime Minister Modi praised the forgotten heroes who had played a role in the country's struggle for independence, pledged to wipe out misogyny and erase all traces of servitude. He said his country must become a developed nation in 25 years. The results of Kenya's much-awaited presidential election will be known shortly, the electoral body has announced. These are live pictures in Nairobi, where preparations for the declaration are underway at the National Tallying Centre. Deputy President William Ruto has a narrow lead over ex-Prime Minister Raila Odinga in the latest count. Supporters of both Mr. Odinga and Mr. Ruto, dressed in party clothes and in a celebratory mood, have gathered at various centres across the country to wait for the announcement. There continues to be heavy Russian shelling on several towns in the eastern region of Donetsk, but Ukrainian forces and officials say they've managed to repel many of the attacks. Meanwhile, in southern Ukraine, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called for the establishment of a demilitarized zone around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant over fears of a catastrophe caused by renewed shelling there. Our correspondent Hugo Bachega is in Kiev for us. That was Hugo Bachega there. Well, just a reminder of our top story. It's been 1 year since the Taliban seized Kabul and Afghanistan. In the past half an hour, there's been an explosion in the capital, Kabul, injuring 2 people. According to the Taliban, explosives were planted in a wheelbarrow in front of a hotel. The Taliban have declared a national holiday to mark 1 year since they seized power. Celebrations have been taking place in Kabul. The movement's black and white flags are flying in the main square in the capital, and pickup trucks full of fighters are patrolling the streets. You can get in touch with me on Twitter. I'm at BBC Yalda Hakim. I'll be back in 30 minutes' time with all the latest headlines. Hello, this is Impact. I'm Yalda Hakim. Hundreds of Taliban fighters gather in Kabul Central Square to celebrate the first anniversary of their takeover of the country. There were similar scenes across Afghanistan.
Taliban members and supporters who have gathered here in the centre of Kandahar. Today is the first anniversary of their independence, as they see it, the culmination of their struggle against the US-led international presence here.
We'll reflect on the United States' chaotic exit and examine where Afghanistan stands today. Towns in eastern Ukraine come under fire as the UN calls for a demilitarized zone to prevent nuclear disaster. And water levels on Germany's Rhine River appear to stabilize after dropping dramatically during the current drought. That's all coming up here on Impact. Welcome to the programme. It's exactly a year since the Taliban dramatically and unexpectedly returned to power in Afghanistan, and they've been celebrating on the streets of the capital, Kabul, on what's been declared a national holiday. But serious, deep-rooted issues continue to blight the country, among them severe food shortages and the status of women and girls. Yogita Lamai has all the latest. That was Sekunder Kamani and Lise Doucette joining me there from Afghanistan. Well, General H.R. McMaster, former U.S. National Security Advisor under President Trump and author of Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World. I spoke to him earlier and he says he doesn't believe Taliban officials when they say they have no links to al-Qaeda. Have a listen. That was General H.R. McMaster speaking to me there a little earlier. Well, Afghan journalist Bilal Sawari was forced to leave Afghanistan a year ago. He's now in Toronto in Canada, where he joins me now. Bilal, good to see you. Like so many Afghans, you were forced to leave the country, but I just want you to reflect on the last 12 months and what you've seen unfold in the country. Bilal, thank you as always for joining us here on the programme. Stay with us here on Impact. Still to come, a large part of Germany is in a state of extreme drought. We hear from our correspondent in the city of Maine. This is Impact on BBC World News. I'm Yalda Hakim. There continues to be heavy Russian shelling on several towns in the eastern region of Donetsk. The Ukrainian forces and officials say they have managed to repel many of the attacks. Meanwhile, in southern Ukraine, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called for the establishment of a demilitarized zone around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant over fears of a catastrophe caused by renewed shelling there. Our correspondent Hugo Bachega is in Kiev. Narendra Modi there. Now, water levels in the key German river, the Rhine, appears to have stabilized after dropping dramatically during the current drought. Boats have recently been struggling to navigate through the river, which also serves as an important route for cargo as well as passenger carriers. There were fears the Rhine would become completely unpassable this week, but forecasters say water will remain above this critical level, at least for the next few days. The BBC's Jenny Hill has been monitoring developments in the city of Maine, which is on the Rhine. Bethany Bell reporting there. Now, a reminder of our top story. The Taliban have declared a national holiday in Afghanistan to mark 1 year since they seized power. Hundreds of Taliban fighters have gathered in a central square in Afghanistan's capital, Kabul, to celebrate. They waved the movement's black and white flag and played victory chants about their defeat of foreign armies. But the economic and humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan is deepening. Many are out of work and girls and women are still being excluded from work or formal education? Of course, you can send me all of your thoughts on Twitter. I'm at BBC Yalda Hakim. Matthew will be here in 30 minutes' time for Global. Goodbye for now.
Hello there. The heat is finally abating across parts of Iberia.